On today's World Insight, a campaign showdown over President Trump's Supreme Court nominee after his COVID-19 recovery, the impact on the election.
It's so tempting for politicians to not have the broader interest of the country at mind when making these recommendations to the court.
And top mission to lift people out of extreme poverty and to meet the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. The best way forward in today's panel discussion. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin today's program in the United States, where the attention has been on the U.S. Senate hearings for Amy Coney Barrett, President Trump's Supreme Court nominee. The Republicans, who currently hold a slim majority in the U.S. Senate, are now trying to confirm Barrett's appointment in the next 2 weeks before the vote on November 3rd for the presidential election. The 48-year-old conservative jurist vowed to judge legal cases impartially, but her selection, so close to presidential election, has sparked a fierce political battle as her approval would cement a 6-3 conservative majority on the 9-member court. Meanwhile, President Trump stepped up his campaign sorties after recovery from COVID-19. How will his choice for Supreme Court justice and his COVID-19 illness influence votes? Let's talk to our panelists, all from the U.S. For more about the ever-changing picture, let's go to our panelists. In Charlotte, North Carolina, we are joined by Mary Curtis, a columnist and the roll call senior leader of the Op-Ed Project. In Iowa City, Professor Timothy Hagel, professor of political science from University of Iowa. In Washington, D.C., Brandon Andrews, entrepreneur and former Hill staffer. It's wonderful to see the three of you once again. Tell me more, Professor Hagel, how this is likely to proceed as we speak. The hearing and then a vote, and then what else?
Well, the hearings, of course, go on Tuesday and Wednesday. The second round is on Wednesday. Then the Senate Judiciary Committee will do some business internally. Basically have to wait about a week before they can get together again and have the vote in the committee to determine whether they want to advance the nomination to the full Senate. There's some question procedurally as to whether there will be enough Democrats there to have a quorum so that they can actually have a vote along those lines. And if they do, then they'll advance the vote to the full Senate. If not, there may be some other procedural ways to bring that nomination to the full Senate, and eventually that will happen too. Basically, we won't know for sure until the end of October as far as whether the nomination is going to have a vote before the election, so it's going to be very close.
So, Mr. Andrews, will this likely to happen before the election?
It's very, very difficult for Democrats to stop the process, if not impossible at this point. They can certainly slow it down. I think the fact that there are a couple of Republican members, and we'll see if that number changes as we get closer to the election. There are several Republicans who are in very tough races, and that may impact their feelings about this SCOTUS nomination moving forward during a presidential election. But at this point, there's very little that Democrats can actually do to stop it. If they were able to get a couple other Republicans to potentially not show up at the committee or potentially to raise some kind of point of order once the nomination moves forward to the floor of the Senate, they could certainly slow it down or stop it. But with the numbers now, it's pretty much impossible.
Ms. Curtis, tell me, how do you see this procedure about confirming a Chief Justice vis-a-vis the process leading up to the presidential election? How they intertwined, and which is likely to aid which or actually dragging the other down? This is a very interesting question.
Those Republican senators who are in tight races, such as, say, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who is, the Judiciary Chairman, who is considering and questioning Judge Barrett, he feels that it will bring home those Republican voters that may have some doubts about the style of President Trump, but they will be very heartened that he is delivering on these conservative justices. On the other hand, you have senators in swing states, more swing states, like Senator Susan Collins of Maine, a Republican who is also in a tough race, and she needs some, Democrats and independents to come on her side to win that election, and so she's in a little more precarious spot. So it really is different. Now, on the other hand, Democrats basically knows there really is not much that they can do about it, but they are that it will bring their voters to the polls and motivate them, because they'll be so angry that this nomination is being pushed forward so quickly when the Senate is not doing any COVID relief, the Congress isn't, and when it's so different from how it was treated when President Obama, that he nominated Merrick Garland at the end of his, his presidency, and the Republicans held it up. So they're hoping that will motivate their voters.
I do notice that Judge Barrett has been trying to hide herself somewhat, or being ambiguous about certain thorny issues, for example, about gay marriage, about abortion rights, and also about voting rights, and then about Affordable Care Act. All of these, of course, are very crucial topics for the upcoming presidential election. So how does that work? Why would she do that? Is that really going to help her for her confirmation? What about for the other two political candidates for the president? Professor Hagel, help me to understand all of this.
In terms of judicial nominees, and particularly those at the Supreme Court level, we really don't expect them to weigh in on how they would vote in any particular case. In fact, and this is what Judge Barrett has said repeatedly in her hearings, in her question and answer sessions, is that it's inappropriate for judges to do that. And it's often referred to as the Ginsburg rule, because Justice Ginsburg in her confirmation hearings indicated that she would not give any hint or clue as to how she would vote on any particular case. Of course, justices or justice nominees have been doing that well before Ginsburg, but as Judge Barrett indicated, Justice Ginsburg, or then Judge Ginsburg, indicated it in a very articulate and very precise way. And so that's how it's often referred to. So that's appropriate for her to not give any particular answers. It's not really dodging, and it's not refusing to answer. As far as the thorny issue question, well, those happen to be the questions. And even on a few times when some of the senators asked other questions about other types of cases, she would say, Judge Barrett would say, no, I can't really go down that. That's a hypothetical. I need to avoid answering that kind of thing. So that's not unusual. What has to happen is that the senators need to question her on things like her judicial philosophy, but also any writings that she's had. And they've done that to a certain extent in terms of dissents that she's maybe had, or opinions that she's written from one sort or another. And as a result, they can go ahead and talk about those kinds of things rather than specific cases that might come before the court if Barrett is confirmed.
What's going to happen to the Chief Justice, and therefore to the so-called the 9 system, the Chief Justices, how they are ideologically going to be divided? Whether this time we're going to see, if Judge Barrett is going to be confirmed, that's going to be, many suppose, 3 to 6. So very different picture compared to a few years ago. That's why people are paying so much attention to this. Mr. Andrews, how about the debate within the United States? Is that likely to be the angle? And how is that mixed up with the, shall we say, the drama of the presidential election, also concerning ideology, concerning political philosophy?
Well, that's a great question, Tian. If Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed to the Supreme Court, it would solidify a conservative majority for a significant amount of time, because many of the conservative members of the court that were recently confirmed are fairly young, and so you can expect them all to be serving for potentially 20, 30, even potentially 30 years. Some people would see that as justification for the Republican Party making this trade-off with Donald Trump, someone who in many regards has taken the party in a much different direction, a direction that a lot of Republicans even don't agree with. The other piece is, if you're a Democrat, you're now thinking about, okay, there's 9 justices, but there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that says that there has to be 9 justices. There's been fluctuations in terms of the numbers and of justices over the history of the United States. Is not a change to that number, hasn't happened in quite some time. And quite frankly, I think when it comes to Supreme Court justices at this point, whether it's confirming during a election year or just appointing them more generally, the political treat that's there, it's so tempting for politicians to not have the broader interest of the country at mind when making these recommendations to the court, and think, what can I do for my party? Right. And so I think some reform is definitely going to be advocated for moving forward. Professor
Hagel, how do you see that question? The interests of the country, it really ups to interpretation, isn't it, particularly at this stage?
You know, it's hard to say as far as the interest side of things goes. As far as the court packing side of things, which means adding members to the Supreme Court, and Mr. Andos is absolutely correct in terms of that number is not set by the Constitution. It's something that Congress sets and it can change it, but it's also been at 9 for about 150 years, and so there's a lot of history behind it. And so the question is, well, if that number is changed, is it really in the country's interest to have a balanced court? Well, to some extent it is, but on the other hand, that balance on the court changes over time. Sometimes it's very slow change, but it does changes. 50 years ago, the liberals had a solid majority and moved the court to the left and moved the law to the left, and liberals, of course, like that. Then it swung back to the middle, kind of back and forth a little bit over the intervening years, and now there's this potential to have a conservative majority, and a little bit more reliable conservative majority, because to a certain extent, Chief Justice Roberts and even Justice Gorsuch sometimes vote with the liberals, so you can never be 100% sure how it's going to go. And so in that sense, when you're talking about the interests of the country, one thing that's often important is to have an independent judiciary, and some concerns about having additional members join the court just to have that balance is whether it really destroys that independence, because it's not just a matter of having balance. That certainly if Democrats wanted to pack the court, so to speak, that it would be perhaps enough to make sure that they had liberal majorities for issues that came before the court, and that's something that's fine to have the balance shift to a different side from conservative to liberal, and that's certainly going to happen at some time in the future, even with 9 justices. But the question is if you do it just for purely political reasons in the short term, well, then Republicans do the same thing when they get power again. And as someone joked, that ultimately we may have a Supreme Court with 500 members.
I hope that's not going to happen. Otherwise, the hearing is going to go on and on and on. Ms. Curtis,
Professor Hagel makes a really good point, because what is lost is the public's confidence in an independent judiciary. And President Trump has said, my judges, a Trump judge, an Obama judge, a Bush judge. And the judges themselves, including Chief Justice John Roberts, would like to say we're all just the judges and we look at the cases and decide. But people are becoming losing some of that confidence. And when you lose that confidence in the independent judiciary, then that's a problem.
The 3 of you are much more experienced and knowledge about the judicial system in your country and the balance of power. But I'm asking you also about the same question. You know, have you seen something like this before? Can we have an earlier anchor to compare to what it is today? How are things resolved earlier, and how much light would it help us to find at the end of the tunnel during this process? A very a dramatic period of time, certainly in American politics as a whole. Professor Hagel, tapping into your professorial expertise.
It's not sure that it's going to resolve itself that quickly, but we have had a number of times in the past where things have been very intense for one reason or another, and I mentioned the court packing idea of adding justices to the court. So back in the late 30s, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, tried to do legislation to get us out of the Depression, and it kept getting overturned by the Supreme Court, and that he came up with the idea of adding justices to the court that would side with him on the legislation so he could get the country moving in the way he wanted to. Well, that idea fell through. The Senate didn't like it, and eventually a couple of justices started changing their votes, and things progressed the way that he wanted to, and the idea was dropped. So at a certain point, sometimes we just have to muddle through until we get to the point where things resolve themselves. So it's not always a matter of coming up with some great idea that's all of a sudden going to solve this great problem. Sometimes it's just a matter of, again, muddling through until people sort of relax and can find some common ground, hopefully, to solve some of these issues.
Yeah. Is muddling through, Mr. Andrews, the key word?
Yeah, muddling through is functionally how it works sometimes, but the system of government does work. The Constitution, the principles laid out do work. I think you will see and continue to hear calls for significant reforms, not just to the Supreme Court. You'll continue to hear a lot of progressives want to get rid of the filibuster in the Senate, among other things. That would be significant changes, get rid of the Electoral College, among other things. And so these are conversations that we need to have, but ultimately we're always able to find the path forward, even if it's not as pretty as we want it to be.
There are urgent needs for the Supreme Court to function because there are a lot of issues on the line for the 9 or, you know, whatever the number of people there to decide and to help or to interact with the political leadership. So, Ms. Curtis, what about that muddling through process vis-a-vis some of the urgent issues that's in front of America, shall we say it that way?
It is true that I think the court, usually you don't think of the courts in that way, but now they're in the middle of so many crucial issues that the country is polarized about. And so that's why the senators were trying to get at, you know, what her beliefs were, because as Professor Hagel said, now there's this very strong conservative bent, as opposed to John Roberts, who used to seem to try to pull things back to the center when he had to. So I do think, yes, that this is a big issue, and muddling through won't, it's going to get a little more heated. And also you have other places in the election that so many people on both sides who are very close to their candidates, we have seen some of threats of violence and other things coming out of it. So the law and following the Constitution and the law, as Mr. Andrews said, is all we have. So I think there's a lot of pressure on the court to bring it back to the law, particularly when you have these big issues and people are going to be mad no matter how they're decided.
Right. Now, final question for every one of you, and brief answer, please. As we are seeing this political saga going on, what are some of the most important areas that all of us should pay attention to about this hearing and also about the later political process? Professor Hagel.
As far as the hearings are concerned, we want to see whether the Democrats are able to find some particular way to criticize Judge Barrett that might draw some Republicans over to their side. It doesn't look like that's going to happen, but there may be something that comes up. We don't know at this point. And what we've seen in the last, well, not the last 2 hearings, but certainly the last hearing, is that sometimes information comes out late that maybe changes the dynamic of what's going on. But then we also have to wait to see in terms of what she does when she gets on, if she gets on the court, what she's going to do, how she's going to interpret laws, and how to interpret some of those important issues that Ms. Curtis was talking about.
Well, I do think that it looks that she will be, Judge Barrett will be confirmed. And if so, it might be the most partisan and closest vote that we've had in quite a while, if ever, on the court. And if that happens, I do think there will need to be some repair work and, cause people to have more trust in an independent judiciary devoid of the politics and not to be aligned with the politicians.
The decision over this past week of the Supreme Court basically ending the United States Census, so basically ending the count, underscores the importance of Supreme Court nominees and also underscores the importance of the election. And I'm sure Democrats will be using the fact that the census was ended as a way to get out the vote in advance of November.
Brendan Andrews, Timothy Hagel, last but not least, and Mary Curtis. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much. You're watching World Insight. Still to come on our program today. Top mission to lift the people out of extreme poverty and to meet the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. The best way forward in a panel discussion. Stay with us.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei. Go beyond the headline.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. At this year's UN General Assembly, world leaders spoke their minds at virtual meetings on COVID-19 pandemic. Many sought to forge ahead with the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, a blueprint of sorts for humankind's prosperity. They recognize that ending poverty must go hand in hand with sustainable economic growth and cover basic needs such as education, health, and jobs. China has a long history of such commitment. After having lifted more than 850 million people out of extreme poverty, that's over 70% of the total global poverty figure. With less than 10 years to go to meet those goals, how are member nations doing and how has the UN helped? What's the best way to fix uneven development? Earlier, I hosted a panel discussion on the SDGs and China's poverty reduction experience. Take a look.
We 我们相会云丹，更有新的意蕴。
Will have 6% of the world population remaining in extreme poverty. So we will miss the goal of zero poverty by 2030.
We talk about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We don't have the time to go through all of them, but Ms. Trunkman is coming from the United Nations Development Program. Your job is to work on development. Tell us how it works, these goals, and how it will help us to reduce poverty.
Well, thank you for having me, Tian Wei. It's a great pleasure. And indeed, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were agreed by world leaders in 2015, and they are the goals to end poverty, reduce inequality, and save our planet for future generations to come by 2030. So they are our roadmap in development, if you like, promoting development in all countries. And I think we have seen actually good progress on the MDGs and the SDGs over the last few decades. But I think what we're also seeing, and that is important for me as a development professional, is that progress is slowing. We had lifted, as a world community, 1 billion people out of poverty over the last 4 decades. But now we're seeing progress slowing, and our projections, for example, on poverty, the goal number 1 that you highlighted, are that by 2030, we will have 6% of the work population remaining in extreme poverty. So we will miss the goal of zero poverty by 2030. We're also seeing the number of hungry people increasing in the world. We are at 800 million people going hungry, and this number jumped by 25% between 2014 and 2018. And I think the worrisome bit is that this was before the pandemic, before COVID-19. So now you add the impact of the pandemic, and our projections are showing that in 2020, there's likely to be between 70 and 100 million people being pushed back into extreme poverty. As UNDP, we're estimating that for the first time in 30 years, the Human Development Index, which measures progress in 3 dimensions, incomes, health, and education, will regress globally for the first time in 30 years. And I think what we're seeing in the economies is that this double shock on supply and demand side is also making those who were secure previously, making them vulnerable. And I'm talking in particular about informal sector workers who constitute half of global jobs. They've seen a decrease in their income in the first 2 months of 60%.
You have set a picture for us, which I'm afraid is not that optimistic a picture as a result of particularly COVID-19. Now, Professor Sachs, you've been working as top advisors to the UN Secretary General for years. Tell me about your realistic assessment of our situation right now, particularly regarding poverty reduction.
Well, of course, as we've just been hearing, COVID-19 is a huge setback. It's disrupted the world economy very seriously. It has hit the poor exceptionally hard because of disruption of trade, disruption of tourism, disruption of remittance income, all of the internal dislocations that are taking place in most of the world as the virus spreads, the direct impact on health and disease. It's a bad situation right now, but it's compounded by the failures of leadership, especially the United States, which has pulled out of the World Health Organization at the peak of the pandemic, absurd, by the insufficiencies of international finance structures to really be in line with the sustainable development goals.
Probably that's what the development experts would say. There will be, and there is, a longer list of challenges. But Professor Creamer, if I could put a question of choice in front of you, what would be the solution? Would that be the global cooperation, as Ms. Trunkman and Professor Sachs have clearly illustrated, or would that be individual countries trying to make their cases work so that eventually, altogether, there will be a better picture? What choice would you do?
Well, right now, the biggest challenge the world is facing, let me focus on the short term, the immediate. The biggest challenge the world is facing is clearly the COVID-19 epidemic. The IMF estimates that we're losing, or the World Bank estimates we're losing $500 billion every month that the epidemic continues. The ultimate solution to the epidemic is going to be a vaccine. If you think about the technological characteristics of a vaccine, once we develop a vaccine, it should be usable around the world. So what we need to do, and there are a variety of ways that could be done, is to invest heavily in developing such a vaccine. That could be through a single coordinated international effort, or it could be through individual national efforts in a context where countries can make arrangements to invest in vaccines that are produced in other countries.
This is only the start for a crisis management. There are bigger ones and bigger things that we have to handle as we go along if we could deal with COVID-19. for now. Ms. Pearson, poverty reduction is not a slogan. It has to be done every day through everything that we are trying to achieve. I know you've been living in China. You've also been traveling in Africa when you were young, and then living in Europe. You've seen different parts of the world, how they are dealing with poverty reduction. Tell me more about immediate reaction to what they have to say earlier.
Well, Tianwei, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. This is the most important topic. Companies and countries understand that, or they don't. And if they don't really have a future in the multilateral sphere. You say I've lived in different countries. Yes, I have, but the people's desires are no different. One's geography should not determine their destiny. You say we can call you way. And what I'm interested in is how you create a way to the table for people whose voices isn't being represented. And what I've noticed during the COVID epidemic, different voices have come to the fore. No longer is the most important person in your government the head of the Ministry of Defense. It's the head of the Ministry of Disease Control. We're fighting an invisible enemy. When one person in the world has COVID, we all potentially have COVID. I was in Malaysia when it broke out with a client from Guangzhou selling drones to do agricultural spraying. We were on FaceTime, WeChat to his family in Wuhan, watching them in lockdown on New Year Day. Not much fun. Flew straight back to China. What did he do in Guangzhou? He adapted his drone to spray ambulances, to clean the area. China is a highly adaptive society. I've been at work for the last 9 months every day in my office because China has created a way for me to come to the table to deal with multilateral voices like this and to understand the future of a survival economy which we are in globally.
I love the example you give about poverty reduction, how it should be done on a daily basis. Mr. Ambassador, coming from Rwanda, you are here living in China. I know your country and China has been working together on health and education, exactly some of the points Claire mentioned. Could you help us to understand what are some of the things that our panelists who are joining us from all over the world, as well as our audience, they should take note of?
Thank you very much, Wei, for the opportunity. I want to thank the panelists who just spoke. And let me say that pre-COVID-19 period, Rwanda was considered among the top 10 fastest growing economies. And that's not about the figures of growth of 8%, and by the third quarter of 2019, we were growing at 11.9%. It's not about those numbers. It's in fact about the number of people who are helped to leave the poverty level. And we can see the numbers in Rwanda. We were able to bring down the poverty levels from 60% all the way down to 30%, and the extreme poverty from 40 to 16%. We'll talk about multilateralism and the role of multilateral institutions like the UN and its agencies, and bilateral cooperation between countries, example you just gave between Rwanda and China, and the national institutions. I think we need to focus mainly on building the strong national institutions and look at homegrown solutions like the experience we have in Rwanda and China. But talking about China-Rwanda cooperation, precisely because of the national priorities that are geared towards addressing the challenges of poverty to our people, including education, health, and opportunity. China, through our cooperation, bilateral cooperation, but also under the framework where China cooperates with the African continent, China supports a number of programs that supports people to leave poverty. One being health by constructing hospitals, but also providing other services related to the sector. Number two, in the area of education, in the context of supporting Rwanda as a country that's trying to build a knowledge-based economy, China also contributes to education. Another area that I want to talk about, when it comes to poverty reduction, access to potable water, drinking water is very critical. And as we speak today, China is doing about 200 wells in Rwanda, supporting rural population to have access to water. I can also talk about mining area. Mining sector is normally considered to be an economic sector. But remember, in some of our countries, mining has always been artisanry. It's being done today by ordinary people who toil every single day to make a few cents. But when you bring in technology, which China is doing today, It means you are going to make it commercial and increase the incomes for the people who are otherwise under poverty line.
I see. It seems that you're trying to say there are several areas that one has to address when it comes to poverty reduction. Education, basic health care, and even infrastructure in this regard, the water system, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
Will that be the key? May I ask, Professor Ghiolacci, you're based in Italy. I'm sure you have your different observations.
Indeed, I should tell you that in the previous government, we did flirt with the idea of universal basic income in Italy. We tried to introduce it. It was a mixed success. I'm very honest about it. For two reasons. One was to reintroduce young people into the workforce. But a large part of it was actually aimed at poverty alleviation in Italy, where about 10% of the population, according to some official statistics, live below the poverty line. So we are looking at a G7 country that maybe for reasons that other people in the panel are more expert than I to understand, maybe globalization, surely bad management on the side of government, have led to a very wide disparity and not a relative, but an absolute decline in the standard of living.
What about for Russia? Mr. Yakunin, you're joining us. The other guests have been talking about solutions, and they were particularly emphasized on implementation of solutions and plans. In Russia's case, and from your perspective, poverty reduction and the overall sustainable agenda.
Listen, I don't think that Russia differs very much from the entire world, despite all the specifics of our community and our development, specifically now during the pandemic, we are hurt as much as everybody else. This is one thing. On the other thing, you know, of course, it is extremely difficult that through all the periods since the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, that we are trying to establish new institutions, and so far, you know, still we have a way to go for the settlement. On the other hand, I should see that it is not just the ability or the wealth of the particular country when we are talking about the helping of the other regions and the other countries. It does not matter we are talking about Russia, we are talking Italy, we are talking United States of America. You know, it is absolutely obvious, and I follow latest interview of Professor Sachs when he was saying that the poor government, it is not the reason for the country to be poor, it's vice versa. Sometimes because of the absence of the resources, the governance is not at a high level. Therefore, I completely agree with Professor Kramer that, you know, when we are fighting, for example, a pandemic, we should unite the efforts of entire international community. It is not possible for just one country to settle all the issues of the world, and pandemic is the worldwide issue.
Let me ask you, Ms. Zhang, you'll be listening to your colleagues. I know you have been personally participating in various poverty reduction programs in China and beyond through UNEP. Tell me more about, among all of these things your colleagues mentioned, which one you think and you experienced that are really working?
Well, thank you very much, Wei. And I think I agree with most of the points that that poverty alleviation has many dimensions. But I think there are one nature I wanted to say, because SDGs has 17 goals, 169 targets. The key is all the goals and targets are interconnected. Whatever else you pick it up, it contributes to poverty alleviation. So in my experiences, I used to be working in the Chinese Academy of Sciences before I joined UNEP as a development economist working on poverty alleviation. So one area I was picking up is, because lots of people working on invest in kind of infrastructure and services and employment or somehow, I pick it up at early childhood education. Because you can alleviate poverty today, but if you want to sustain the results, you need to make sure there's no intergenerational poverty trap. What do? You start from the very beginning. First 1,000 days is the most crucial stage for the babies who develop their cognitive skills and the social emotions, and also they are kind of other kind of mobility, big mobility. So, but this is an area a lot of developing countries has not paid attention. When we went to the rural areas, a lot of people were having cognitive development delay in babies in the countryside. They're not born kind of stupid. It's just because if you want to develop a cognitive skill, you have genes matters, but nutrition also matters, and a kind of parenting environment matters. But not many people are paying attention to that. In the urban areas, you have parenting centers, you have early childhood development centers. But in the rural areas, first, the commercial organization don't go because it's not profitable.
Right. So how did it work?
So it worked. Of course it worked. We traced all the babies when they were in these programs or not in the program. We used the testing, like Bailey scale testing. We found that the babies who had this training or the parents knows how to play with their babies, they grow much faster in terms of all the kind of dimensional kind of scales you wanted to measure as a child. But Lancet had a special issue called investing in early childhood would result in much higher returns in the future because you don't want the poor population ending into a poverty trap.
Thank you so much for sharing all of these stories and also ideas about poverty reduction, not only here in the studio, but also joining us online. As all of you indicated, we are still having tremendous challenges ahead. However, with global cooperation and multilateral actions, we are working toward a better and more sustainable future. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can certainly search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.